So, you want to learn Pro Tools? The good news is that in this video I'm going to show you exactly that. This video is brought to you by Milea.com, the place where you can learn everything you need to know about audio production. In 2007 I created my first ever Pro Tools session, and today, 14 years later, I'm going to show you step by step the essentials you need to know about Pro Tools, so that you can be up and running in different scenarios. Hey, I'm Adrian from Milea.com, and today I'm going to show you how to use Pro Tools as a digital audio workstation. But before we do that, if you want to improve your mixes and masters in less than 10 minutes, get your cheat sheet here. When I started to be interested in Pro Tools, you had to have an audio interface on which you could run the Pro Tools Empowered version, or a DigiDesign audio interface on which you could run Pro Tools LE or HD. The main two versions of Pro Tools I was interested at that moment were the Pro Tools LE or Lite Edition and the professional version, Pro Tools HD, where you were able to use the so-called TDM plugins. In my case, when I started with Pro Tools, I bought a DigiDesign M-Box 2, and with it came the Pro Tools LE 7. And when the Pro Tools 8 was launched, I was really excited about the new interface.
Așteptăm să vedem cum apare Pro Tools-ul, ce interfață are.
Da, interesant. Noul Pro Tools. Bine, ne întoarcem la treabă.
A couple of years later, in 2010, Avid, which bought DigiDesign, released Pro Tools 9, and as Sound on Sound magazine mentions in a 2011 article, for the first time ever, Avid have made the full Pro Tools feature set available on native systems, and you don't even need one of their interfaces. So starting with the 9th version, you could use Pro Tools with audio interfaces from other companies, or even with just the interface from your computer. Today I'm going to show you how to use Pro Tools on this 2018.1.0 HD version, because this is the version I'm using at this point. So chances are that when you'll watch this video, your version of Pro Tools might be slightly different, but keep in mind that the main functions, settings and workflows should be the same to some extent. Before we jump into the Pro Tools presentation, I should point out that at the moment of creating this video, you can choose between three options. Pro Tools first, which you can use for free, but there are some limitations. Then there's the Pro Tools option, in case you don't need extra DSP processing. Or you can opt for the Pro Tools Ultimate version, in case you need some extra features and DSP processing power. As a side note, you can find more information on DSP processing with Pro Tools by visiting this page where you can learn about the HDX systems. In my case, I use the Avid HD Omni audio interface plus Pro Tools HD, which nowadays is called Pro Tools Ultimate. And if you have an internet connection, it seems that with the newest versions of Pro Tools, you don't need a physical iLok. Interesting. So let's actually create a session. When you start Pro Tools for the first time, you might have some dialog popping out, and then you should have this dashboard. And the first option we have here is to create a new session. For now, let's give a name to our new session. And here you can see there are some options that you can choose from. In this case, for example, we can collaborate with other audio producers or engineers, that is, we can work on the same session from multiple parts of the world, but we need to sign in. And here's the option of backing up the session to cloud, which is pretty cool. Next, in case you create lots of recording sessions or mixing or mastering sessions and so on, you have the option of creating templates that can help you in saving tons of time. And here are some examples of the templates that I created and use for an easier workflow. Now, let's get back to the local storage option. In the recent section, after you will work with some sessions, you will see the recent ones that you can choose to reopen and work further. And here's where you will find your cloud projects, but again, you should be signed in. So the main options we have is to work on a session that we store on a computer, or you can store your session on a cloud and maybe work with other audio producers on it. For this video, I'm going to create a session and store it on my computer. But before we do that, we need to take care of some settings first. And I'm going to show you the exact settings I use. For example, in the file type, I always use WAV. Then in the bit depth section, there are three options that you can choose from. But in my case, in the last couple of years, I used and continue to use the 24-bit. In the sample rate section, depending on the material I'm working on, I choose between 44.1 or 48 kHz. So when you choose the sample rate and bit depth of your session, think of it as of choosing the resolution of a video, for example. Only in our case, we'll choose the resolution for audio. Just to give you an example, if I create a session for my own production, I will use 48 kHz. But sometimes, when I receive a 44.1 kHz sessions from clients, I would leave the session at the original sample rate. But again, this is not set in stone. It is always changing case by case. The thing is that if you will choose a sample rate and a bit depth of 48 kHz by 24 bits, you're good to go. And by the way, I discuss in details about what sample rate you should choose in my Pro Audio Mastering program, and that is in case you're interested in audio mastering. Next, in the input-output settings, if you just start with Pro Tools, I would choose the stereo mix option. That is, if you don't need the 5.1 film mix option and just want to produce some music, record some vocals, or just treat a voiceover. Next, I check this interleaved option, and then here you can choose the location where you want the newly created session to be saved. In case you just want to open a session from your computer, you can just click on Open from Disk and select your session. If you want to see the dashboard every time you open Pro Tools, select this Show on Startup option. In case it doesn't show up, here's the Pro Tools menu. Go to File, and there are different options that you can choose from, and open your session. So after you selected the options you need, click Create. And here's the Edit window, where I usually spend most of my time during production, mixing and mastering sessions. The other main window is the Mix window, where you can see all the tracks of your sessions aligned as into a kind of audio console. This is a great option for the mixing stage, for example, where you can see more tracks than in Edit window, but also you get rid of different distractions, like for example, you won't see any markers or wave clips. On the left, you will see in this section all the tracks in your session, and here are all the groups, in case you will group certain tracks together. The shortcut for changing between the Edit and Mix window is Command + on Mac for a quicker workflow. If you hover over the bottom of a track and this icon appears, you can make a track bigger or smaller by dragging it down or up. And this is a default track that appears whenever you create a new session. It is named Click because it is a metronome track that can help you during producing. And on the right, there's the Clips section, where you can find all the clips in your session. And here you have 5 modes that you can use when editing in Pro Tools: Shuffle, Spot, Grid, Real Grid, and Slip. I'm not going into details about these modes in this video, but what I will say is that most of the time I use only the Slip and Grid mode. And if you want a general distinction between them, when you use the Slip mode, you have more freedom, for example, for putting certain samples or notes in different places in a track. However, if you use the Grid mode, you are more restricted, and all this depending on the kind of grid you are selecting. And I'm going to show you an example of this in just a minute. Next, we have different tools that you can use in different scenarios, like horizontal zoom out, audio zoom out, MIDI zoom out, and horizontal zoom in. And here you can store up to 5 settings of these tools. Next, there's the zoomer tool that you can use to magnify samples, for example. With the trim tool, you can shorten notes or make them longer, and this is a tool that you can also use when working with samples. The selector tool can help you when you want to select a certain section in the edit window. And there's the hand or the grabber tool, which, as in the case of the other tools, you can choose between different options, which I'll let you discover by yourself. And you can see that the 3 tools are selected together, and this is the option that I'm using most of the time when I'm working. Then, depending on the position of your cursor on the track, the tools change automatically. However, I know this might be confusing, especially when you start with Pro Tools. This is why I recommend you to use these tools independently, at least at the beginning. Now, for a quicker access, you can use the F8 key on your keyboard to select the grabber tool. And if somehow you will select other options of the grabber tool, continue to press the F8 key until you select the default grabber tool. And same goes with the other editing tools. For example, you can select the selector tool by pressing the F7 key and the trim tool with the F6 key, and so on. Next, we have the scrubber tool, which I don't use very much, and the pencil tool, which also has different options. Next, we have the zoom toggle, the tab to transients that you can use to select the beginning of the next transient by hitting the tab key. Here you can select the mirrored MIDI editing, which I don't use, and here you can select whether you want automation to follow edit. Then here you can select to link the timeline and edit selection, or link track and edit selection, and insertion follows playback. Again, I'm not going into details about this because at the beginning you don't need to worry about them. One option that I do like is the layered editing, which I use whenever I work with tracks that have multiple takes and I want to select the best parts in order to make just one good track. So when this option is enabled, you can see both samples layered. Then here we have the main counter where you can see different information. For example, if I select a random bar, here I can see that it is the 9th bar. And if you want to zoom in with your keyboard, click the R key for zooming in and the T key for zooming out. But in order for this to work, make sure this option is selected, because if it will be gray like this, the R and T shortcut won't work. So we have the main counter where, depending on your needs, you can select between different information to be showed, like bars and beats, minutes and seconds, time code, feet plus frames, samples. And you can also choose to show the sub-counter, but I don't use it. And you saw that when you change this option, the timeline is also changing. In my case, almost 100% of the time I use the bars and beats options, because I use Pro Tools mainly for composing, producing, recording, mixing and mastering. So I'm working mainly with bars. Next, if you go here, you can choose what you want to see on your timeline. In case you don't need an option, you can just deselect it, in order to make more space for work. If you go to the grid section, you can choose how many lines you want your grid to have in a bar. And if you click on grid, the lines disappear. You will see that depending on the material you're working on, you will select different grids for a better workflow. Next, depending on the position of your cursor, you will see different information like the bar, the volume, and so on. In case you will have delay problems in your session caused by a hungry plugin, for example, this delay info will be in red, so you'll have to activate the delay compensation, which I'm going to talk about later. Then here we have the stop, play, and record buttons. To play and stop your session, you can use the spacebar. Same goes when you want to start recording, but in this case you have to click on the record button before hitting the spacebar. Then using these options here, you can move backward or forward in your session. And here's the output meter, where you can see, depending on your selection, the overall signal of your session, or individual tracks. And sometimes you will get different types of errors. That's just the way it is. To find more information on them, just try googling the number of error and you might find a solution. So this was a quick presentation of the edit window in Pro Tools. If you produce music, most of the time you will spend in this window. And in the case of mixing or mastering, you may also spend a lot of time in this window. Now, let's move on. In case you want to import a sample or a track into your session, go to File, Import, and here you have different options. For example, you can import session data, like let's say different tracks with their plugin settings from previous sessions. Then you can import audio tracks and samples, MIDI, video or clip groups. But if you just want to import a stereo mix that you want to master, for example, just click on Audio and select the track you want to import. Then you can select whether to create a new track with your import, or whether you want to send it to the clips list on the right. For now, I'll choose a new track. And if we click here, we can see all the tracks in our session. This is useful because at some point you may choose to deactivate some tracks and hide them. And if you do hide them, you can find them here and activate them if you need to. Next, you can modify the clips gains inside the track by clicking here. In the next section of this video, I'm going to show you how to create different types of tracks in Pro Tools so that you can use them in different scenarios. So let's get to it. To create new tracks, you can either go to Pro Tools menu and select Track and New. Another option is to right-click on a track and select New. Then, this window will appear where you can choose how many tracks you want to create. Then you have other options like how many channels you need for your track, mono, stereo, and so on. And here's where you will choose between different types of tracks. Depending on your needs, you can choose between audio tracks, auxiliary tracks, master faders, which I usually use just one in a session, as the main output of the session, VCA master, which you should not worry about if you're just starting out. Then we have MIDI tracks, instrument, and video tracks. Then here we can create different tracks with different presets. So let's say we need a stereo audio track. In case you need another track, you can just click on the plus sign and add more tracks. Then click on Create. And here we have a stereo audio track, a stereo auxiliary track, a master fader, which we'll use to watch out the stereo output of our session. Then we have a MIDI and an instrument track. In my sessions, I usually put the master fader track at the bottom of the session. It's just how I work. Now, before we move on, I should show you some settings that you should take into consideration. If you want to select an audio interface to work with Pro Tools, go to Setup and select Playback Engine. And here you should be able to see your audio interface, so make sure to select it in case you need it. The next important setting that you will change often is the hardware buffer size. Depending on your computer, you will have to work with these sections. If you want a general recommendation, use a lower number of samples when you record MIDI, instruments or vocals. Then use the highest number of samples when you have lots of plugins in your session, mostly during the mixing and mastering stage. Next, check these options in case you're experiencing different pops and errors. Plus, I recommend you to use the dynamic plugin process, because this option will save you some CPU power in case some of your plugins will not process any audio at different points in your session. And here, you can select the cache size. And you can see here that it is recommended lower values for the disk buffer to reduce memory usage, while higher values improve disk performance. As mentioned, another important setting you need to activate is the delay compensation, because in case you will use hungry plugins, they might cause delay between the tracks in your session. I go in more details on a delay compensation in another video of mine, so be sure to check it out at the end of this video. Next, if your MIDI controller is not automatically connected with Pro Tools, go to Setup, Peripherals, Midi Controller, then you should find it here. For example, I have an Oxygen 49 from M-Audio. So after you made your selection, click OK. And now, if I click on Record on the MIDI track and I play my MIDI controller, we have some information coming in. Next, if you want to mute a track, click on the Mute button. If you want to solo a track, click on the Solo button. In case you want to record MIDI in Pro Tools, click on the Record button on the MIDI track, then click the Record button here and hit the spacebar to record. And sometimes you will get errors. In this case, it is because I didn't choose the right playback engine. To do that, go to Setup and select it here, then click OK. Let's try that again. And you can see that we are recording MIDI, but we don't hear anything. I'll show you why in just a minute. So what we see at this point is just a MIDI clip. If you want to see the notes, click here and select Notes. And if I'm trying to select these notes, for example, I cannot because of the grid mode and my grid selection. But if I select the sleep mode plus the grabber tool, I select whatever I want. Plus, I can also move notes. And if you go back here, you can choose between different options. You can also change the velocity of different notes in case you want to make the MIDI performance seem more natural. Then you can choose to automate the mute and other options, like for example, the panorama. And you have more controls here that is up to you to discover. Okay, so we said that we cannot hear what we're playing in Pro Tools, and that's not really cool. If you want to actually hear the MIDI in Pro Tools, you need to connect the MIDI track with an instrument. To do that, insert an instrument on an instrument track. You can see the inserts in Pro Tools here. So we have 10 insert slots. To insert an instrument or any other plugin, just click on the insert, and here will be the list of different categories of plugins you have available. We said that we need an instrument, so let's select one from our list. For our exercise, I'm going to use Expand 2, an instrument that comes with Pro Tools. By the way, in Pro Tools you can use AAX plugins, and in case you have an audio interface from Avid like a HDX card or Avid Carbon for example, you can also use AAX DSPs, just like in the case of WAD DSP processing, but they are different platforms. So let's select a piano for example. Then go to the MIDI track and select the instrument. You see, here's the name of our instrument track and the instrument we inserted on it. Select channel 1, and if we play now the MIDI track, we actually can hear the notes. So the notes of this MIDI track trigger this instrument because we linked them. If you change the position of a note, you can hear it while you're doing it. Then you can use different event operation in case you need to work more on your MIDI information. For example, let's say we need a part where just a single note to be transposed one octave higher. Select Transpose, one octave, and apply. And the note we have selected was transposed by one octave. In case you need other tools for affecting the MIDI, you can select them here. When I started using Pro Tools, I used MIDI tracks a lot because I was linking them with my keyboards. However, in the last couple of years, I stopped using MIDI tracks because I stopped using synthesizers. Nowadays, I just use a Midi controller, so this is why I started to use instrument tracks instead of Midi tracks, because you can also record Midi on the instrument tracks. Let me show you how. To play an instrument directly on an instrument track, you need to click record and then play your controller. And when I do that, there's a delay between the moment I'm hitting the keys on my controller and the sound that I'm hearing in Pro Tools. If you experience this, go ahead and change the hardware buffer size to a lower number of samples. And that's much better. Now let's record some chords on the instrument track. To make this an easier task, let's select the bar where we want to start recording and put a marker. And by the way, I have an entire video where I discuss how I use markers that you can watch later. To add a marker, select the position or the bar you want to place the marker and click here where it says Add Marker / Memory Location. And let's unmute the metronome and record. Now, let's select our notes, and I cannot select the first note because it was recorded just before the beginning of the second bar. And I'm also in the grid mode. And when I play the selection, you can hear that some notes are not quite at their place, as some of them start earlier than they should. To solve this, we have a couple of tools at our disposal. If you right-click on the selection, here you can select different tools, which are also available here. But there are also some event operations that I showed you earlier. So let's select Quantize, for example. Here you can select the grid on which you want the MIDI to be quantized on. Then you can choose the strength in case you want to make it more natural and not exact sounding. So let's play it again. We still have some notes starting earlier than they should. To solve this, let's change the grid. Then move the notes with the grabber tool. If you want, you can choose different velocity for different notes here. Then with the trimmer tool, you can make notes longer or shorter. You can also personalize the sustain of your instrument here. And if you mute the metronome track, this is what we have so far. Now, how can you modify the tempo in Pro Tools? If you want to modify the tempo, just double-click here and modify the value. Next, let's say that you have different tempos for different sections in your song. If it is so, select the section where you need a tempo change, then click the plus on the tempo line here. And you see that we have the new tempo value here. In case you don't need the tempo change, you can just select it and drag it down and delete it. And in case you need to rename a track, just click here and rename it. Okay, so far we recorded a MIDI track in Pro Tools, but how can you add effects on a track? There are two main options of adding effects on tracks in Pro Tools. The first one, you can insert the effect directly on the track. And let's insert on the second slot a reverb, for example, that comes with Pro Tools. Then you can choose its gain and the dry-wet ratio. But I like to use another option, and I recommend you to use it also. In this case, we'll use an auxiliary track on which we'll insert the effect we need, like a reverb for example. And then, we'll need to send some signal from the instrument track, but we need the send slots in order to do that. To make them available, go here and you can see that we have sends A to E and F to J, and each of these have 5 send slots available. So here you can select and deselect different things in case you need to. Like in our case, we need the send slots. And there they are. If you want to distinguish between inserts and sends, the sends are named A, B, C, and so on. So we said that we want to send some signal from the track piano to the reverb effect. To do this, we'll have to first select an input for the reverb effect. And here's where you can select the track's inputs and outputs in Pro Tools. And you can see that at this point there are some buses named from another session. If you want to see the default buses, go to Setup, Input and Output and Bus. Then hit Default and OK. And now we have 24 buses. Let's select bus 1 and 2 as the input of the reverb effect. And to make our life easier, let's rename the bus 1, 2 to reverb. So now when I want to select the send A, the reverb bus is active, so let's select it. And here's the send fader, which will control the amount of the reverb we want on our track. I recommend you this approach because during mixing, most of the time you want more tracks to go through the same reverb, in case you want to create some unity in your mix. And then if you need to add an EQ on your track, on the next slot you can add the one which comes with Pro Tools. Then you can also add a compressor and so on. So here's where you can see the audio signal of the individual tracks, but here on the master fader you will see the overall signal of the entire session. In case you want to take out the numbering of your tracks, go to View and click here. I also suggest you to insert on the master fader your favorite audio analyzer. And then, in case you want to have in front of you more than one plugin, click on this button here, on those plugins. Because if you don't do this, every time you will click on one plugin, you'll see only that plugin. In case you want to transpose your MIDI, I mentioned that you can do it by octaves, but you can also do it by semitones. And then, to make your selection to sound in a loop, you need to right-click on the play button and select Loop. And if you want to hear your selection in half speed, you can select the option here. And that's the general overview of the edit window in Pro Tools. Now let's talk a bit about the mix window. When you choose the mix window, you have all the active tracks aligned and also the deactivated ones in case you didn't hide them. And you can see in this window we have less distractions. In my case, I usually use the edit window to some extent when mixing, but I also use the mix window. So here we have the inserts, the sends, the inputs and outputs of the tracks, their panorama, record, solo, mute, the volume fader and the track's name. So this track here is the same track that we have here, but it is just laid out differently. And this is typical for other DAWs, not only Pro Tools, that is to have edit and mix windows. So far, we recorded a track in Pro Tools, we added some effects, but now, how do we add some samples in order to make the track more interesting? To import audio samples, go to Import, Audio, and then select your samples. In this case, I have some free samples offered by Slate Digital a while ago. So in this case, I'll use a kick, a clap, and a closed hi-hat. And you can see that the sample rate of these samples are 44.1 kHz 16-bit. But if you remember, we created a session of 48 kHz 24 bits. This is why we'll need to convert the samples. If you won't do this, these samples will play differently than they should, like at a different speed and tone. So, after you selected your samples, convert them and click Done. And here are our samples. Let's arrange them a bit, then you can select them and duplicate them using the Command+D on Mac, and I believe on Windows should be the Control+D. Okay, we got our kick track. Let's repeat the same process for claps and hi-hat tracks. So you can see now we are in grid mode, which is really helpful because we can place the samples where they should be placed so that they could sound synced together. In case you need more lines on your grid, just go here and select Other Options. Then you can experiment as much as you want, and this is what we got so far. Another thing I want to address here is that this is the overall output of your session. If you will hit red, you will need to review your gain staging in the session, and I have an entire video discussing just that. Next, you can also copy the plugins and descents from a track to another. Like in this case, I can copy descent from the instrument track to the claps tracks. And then I could adjust the amount of reverb I need. Now what if you want to record some vocals or an instrument? In case you need to record vocals or instruments, create a mono or a stereo audio track. And a good idea is to name your tracks for a better identification. The next step is to select the input of your track. However, in this case, I cannot select the interface. If this happens, chances are that you didn't select your audio interface as the playback engine. To solve this, go to Setup and select it in the playback engine, then hit OK. And you may also need to restart Pro Tools. And this is another issue that might happen. Sometimes when you will open a session with instrument tracks, they might be gray like in this case. If this happens, I'm going to show you a solution in just a moment. If we go to the track on which we want to record vocals or instruments and so on, you can see that this time we can select some inputs from our interface. After you did that, hit the record button on the track, and then this record button, then hit spacebar. And you should be able to record your source. In this case, I'm not recording anything, I'm just showing you how you can do it. When you do record analog sources like vocals, instruments and so on, the recommendation is for the audio signal peaks to hit about the half of this meter here. I talk about this more in my gain staging video. And now, let's solve this issue with the deactivated MIDI information. So, if this happens, right-click and duplicate the track and boom, the MIDI info is active again. And then you can delete the original track. And don't forget to save your session often. In fact, I have something for you that will save you from lots of headache. So at this point, I'm going to show you some of the settings you need to take care of from the very beginning. So go to Setup, Preferences, Operation, Auto Backup, and be sure to keep at least 10 most recent session backups. This will help you a lot if you will have unwanted errors happen. Also, backup every 1 minute. Then when you want to access the latest backup, go to your session folder and then you will find a folder called Session File Backups. And in that folder, you will find your session backups. Sort them by date, and after you opened your session from a backup file, be sure to save it again with the original name in case you want that. And now that we're here, I want to recommend you other settings that you might find useful, like the number of undo you can use. I always set this to maximum so that I can undo as many changes as possible in case I need it. Next, in the mixing window, you can select your default EQ or compressor, limiter and so on, in case you prefer certain plugins to have ready and for a quicker access. And there's another important setting you can find in the processing section, and that is the automatically copy files on import. This is crucial. If this option is not checked, whenever you import samples and audio tracks, you just copy them into your session, and they will be there working fine as long as you will be on your computer. And once you take your session to another computer, you will find that many samples and audio tracks are missing, and that is because those samples and tracks were not imported in your session at the moment you imported them. So make yourself a favor and check this option here. Next, you can organize your plugins here by category, manufacturer, and so on. For a better navigation, you can also color code your tracks. To do that, just click at the bottom of the track, and here you can choose the color you want. And here, you can choose what you want to color. For example, you can color the clips in the edit window. And then, you can also color multiple tracks with the same color by selecting them, then selecting the color you need. Then you can adjust the saturation, the brightness, and so on. One more thing. In case you don't see the grid mode, just click here or use the F4 key one more time until it appears. In this video we covered a lot, but there's one more thing that you need to do after you finish your track, and that is to bounce your track. When you want to export your session, first you need to select your track between its intro and its ending. Then go to File, Bounce to, Disk, select your output, then the file type, the format, the bit depth and the sample rate. And here you can choose whether to bounce your track offline. Use this option when you have lots of plugins in your session, and then listen one more time to the exported track. However, if you want, you can also bounce the track in real time, and you can do that by unchecking the offline option. Then you can also add an MP3 with your exported track. And then you can also import the exported track after its bounce. And also, don't forget to select the destination folder in the directory section. Then, When you're ready, click on Bounce. And we're done. In the end, we can just thank all the contributors who made it possible for us to use Pro Tools to convert our ideas, feelings, and our passion for music into songs. And I know we covered a lot in this video, but heads up, this is not everything you can do in Pro Tools. However, the main mission of this video is to get you ready for using Pro Tools as a digital audio workstation in different scenarios. And if you watched the entire video, I just want to congratulate you because you just saved years of trials and errors like it was in my case. Now that we covered Pro Tools, in case you want to learn how to create a song from an idea, compose it, write lyrics, produce it, record vocals, mix it, and also to master it, check out my music production masterclass where I cover everything you need to know in order to transform an idea you have on your phone into a mastered song. I'll leave the link below. If you found this video useful, give it a thumbs up using that like button, and of course, help me grow this channel by subscribing. In this way, you will support me to make more videos like this so that I could help as many audio producers as possible. Until next time, stay cool and make great music.